The following program is made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Some biographers have tried to say I didn't know what I wanted to do. Well, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard of. I was going to go to school.
Good cadet.
But I had to get some money.
He was liked by practically everybody. Very popular with the cadets and got along very well with people.
Every time you were out of that room, there was some cadet to scream at you and get your chin back and hold your head up, get your shoulders back, and keep running double time.
Two old soldiers, remembering their days at the point.
You can collect demerits at Westpoint very easily by leaving a handkerchief on the table during morning inspection or forgetting to sweep behind the door or something else.
I never could wear a hat straight anyway. But I got a lot of demerits for things like that, you know. But I wasn't, I wasn't a careful cadet, but I was far from being a troublemaker.
He was a color sergeant, which took, had to carry with it a reputation of being well-dressed at all times and standing up straight and all. I would have probably been quite high because I paid no attention. I'd go to sleep when my roommate would be working, you know. And then in the morning, he'd get up and say, "Do you know anything about this lesson?" I'd say, "No, what is it?" He'd tell me, and I'd go to school that way. We knew we had a good class because we had a lot of athletes in the class, and they usually, or quite often at least, become leaders.
Their class would be known as the class the stars fell on. It would produce 59 generals. 2 of them would earn 5 stars, and 1 would have a direct hand in shaping the mid-20th century world.
The Eisenhower Years, a chronicle in sound of the life of Dwight Eisenhower, produced by Extension Radio Television at Kansas State University. This week, Westpoint and Beyond. Some biographers have tried to say I didn't know what I wanted to do. Well, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard of. I was going to go to school, but I had to get some money. And I stayed out of school 2 years in order to help my brother, who was 2 years older, that went through high school with me. Now, during these 2 years, an old friend of mine from way back in high school days, or earlier, came back to town. His name was Hazlett. He had taken the examination to Annapolis, and he failed, came back, and was studying because he got a reappointment from his local congressman here. He got telling me about these 2 academies, and they got me steamed up about it. So the 2 of us began studying together. And we did it by getting the old examinations that these schools had been putting out for years. And they had the answers and so on. And so we studied and we examined each other. And in the meantime, I had to get busy, try to get an appointment. And that's when Senator Bristow said, "All right, you can take a competitive examination." And this was about, I guess, late in 1910. I took it, and I applied for both. I wasn't proud. I took both Annapolis and Westpoint. Well, to my amazement, I came out 1 all right in the Navy, but 2 in Westpoint. And then they found out that I was too old for Annapolis. Now, the only place to go was Westpoint, but here was a fellow ahead of me. And he failed physically. And so this put me in Westpoint.
So it was that Dwight Eisenhower went Army instead of Navy. He was ecstatic about his acceptance to Westpoint, a free education being quite a bargain. But his elation was somewhat dampened by his mother's reaction.
She didn't like it, but she never made the fuss about it that some people have tried to. She just thought that for one of her boys to go into the Army has something to do with war and so on. She just thought it was bad, rather wicked. And I know that she was sad, and I realize it more than I did then, that she was sad about it, but she never made any argument about it at all.
In June of 1911, the young man from Abilene, Kansas, said goodbye to his mother and youngest brother Milton and set off, suitcase in hand, for the train station. Boarding an eastward-bound train, he bade farewell to the only world he'd known thus far, and eagerly, if not a little apprehensively, looked forward to an exciting new one. At the same time, so did another new cadet to Westpoint, Omar Bradley.
Oh, I had no idea what Westpoint was like. I'd read about people, generals that had been successful leaders being West Pointers, but I had no idea what the course was like until I decided to try to go, and I got a catalog and looked through to see what the various subjects were. But even then, I couldn't visualize the life of the cadets.
Cadet Eisenhower was older than his classmates, and this, together with the independent, self-reliant life he'd led in Kansas and his excellent physical condition, put him ahead of the others. In fact, he was able to relax and enjoy the strenuous physical demands of West Point, and to good-naturedly shrug off the exacting disciplinary standards and traditions of a military institution.
Every time you were out of that room, there was some cadet to scream at you and get your chin back and hold your head up, get your shoulders back, and keep running, double time there, mister. Everybody called it Mr. Dumgard, Mr. Ducrow, and all that. All that was part of the game.
Ike's conduct record could never be held as a sterling example to later cadets.
They gave you demerits for being late at formation, for a little dust in your corner of your room, or your linen not piled properly in your locker and all that. Well, I couldn't be bothered with such things, and so I got lots of demerits. But I didn't get many demerits for vicious things, or for example, I never got anything. I never was caught drinking or anything like that.
So it's very easy to pick up demerits at West Point. It doesn't mean that he was bad, it just means that he got caught on some carelessness or something. I had a roommate that I lived all 4 years with, and he couldn't see things that were wrong. He'd go off to start off the class, leaving a handkerchief on the table, for example, and he didn't see it. I'd always get him out of the room and take one last look before I'd go to class, because if I were orderly, I might get room order for that week. I might get the demerits for it. So Ike's demerits were things like that, mostly.
I wasn't a careful cadet, but I was far from being a troublemaker.
In cheerful defiance of the rules, Ike would sometimes indulge his whimsical sense of humor by playing pranks on his seniors. One of his favorites was the time he and a classmate were ordered to report for disciplinary action in full-dress coats. These were cutaway coats with long tails in back, tailored straight across the waist in front. Having decided to literally obey that order, the 2 jokers appeared before the corporal wearing the required coat, and not a stitch more. Their fellow classmates loved it, but the corporal failed to see the humor and severely reprimanded them. While Ike had steadfastly resolved to get a college education, his interest in academics was decidedly lacking.
Well, the first year, I think it was my best. I think I was about 50 out of about 200, something like that. But I ended up with, I think they tell me, 61 out of 162 people. But I would have probably been quite high because I paid no attention. I'd go to sleep when my roommate would be working, And then in the morning he'd get up and say, "Do you know anything about this lesson?" I'd say, "No, what is it?" He'd tell me, and I'd go to school that way.
The attention and motivation missing from Ike's schoolwork and conduct were poured into sports, and he succeeded in winning a place on the football team. His all-consuming devotion to football earned him a New York Times accolade as one of the most promising backs in Eastern football in 1912. He had his name emblazoned on a bronze plaque on the wall of the Westpoint Gymnasium. He worked hard and long at improving himself, but all his efforts and expectations were shattered during an Army game in 1912.
We were playing toughs, and what happened, I was the plunging back, and I went through for a fairly fair game, but as I went past, a man got a hold of me on my foot, and it wasn't his fault, but me, wanting anxious to get every last foot, I lunged ahead, and my foot was twisted, you see, so when I really helped him, I was really the one that hurt myself, because my foot was twisted around like that while I threw my whole weight and power ahead, and I could feel something rip, although it didn't particularly hurt. I could hear it and feel it. And when I got up the next time, and I went on for another play or two, then they had the ball, and they kicked to us. And I went back with Pritchard as my job, and I went to turn, and I fell, and I realized something happened. I couldn't get up. So they took me off the field, and I never got back on as a player again.
The injury was a crushing blow to Ike, and he seriously considered dropping out of West Point.
When I found I couldn't do anything, that I was just going to be
somebody on the sidelines or sitting up in the bleachers. It was just too hard for me to accept for a while. That's when I started to smoke. I never had smoked before that. And I began, my own classmates made me the cheerleader for my last year and things like that. But it was only their persuasion that kept me from resigning, because I'd made out the papers 2 or 3 times, but then they'd talk me out of it, and so I'd tear them up and start over again.
Ike's knee had been permanently weakened by the football accident. It was further weakened by a riding accident, so much so that Ike very nearly lost his commission.
They knew about this injury because I'd been back and forth into the hospital a number of times. I'd twist it, and I'd be back for a day or two. And so Colonel Shaw, a very fine man, was actually deeply concerned about the possibility that I would be commissioned, then would have to retire in a year or two, and would be a permanent liability on the Army. So the question was to commission or not to commission. Well, he called me up, and I said, well, I didn't care too much. I said, I'll just take my savings that they had made for, forced savings, I must add, because I never would have done it probably. But I said I'd take that and go to Argentina. I, for some reason, always had this yen to go and see the Argentine. He said, well, he'd look me over and think it over. And in a few days, he called me back, and he said he realized that my great part of my injury was riding. I mean, that was a serious injury. So he said, Mr. Eisenhower, if you will not ask for a mounted service, I will recommend you for commission. I said, that's all right with me. I want to go in the infantry anyway. And so my preference sheet came around about, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks before graduation, or maybe 2 or 3 months, I've forgotten. I said, infantry, 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 and I got the infantry.
No one would have guessed at the time that Ike's class would be the one the stars fell on. Years later, he and many of his classmates would rank among the great American generals. One of them, General Omar Bradley.
We knew we had a good class because we had a lot of athletes in the class, and they usually, or quite often at least, become leaders. And we had the largest class that had graduated up to that time.
In the annals of Westpoint, Dwight Eisenhower would not be remembered for outstanding academic achievement or for exemplary conduct. Instead, he would be warmly recalled for his engaging personality, his friendliness, good humor, fond regard for his fellows, and his natural abilities as a leader. Suspended precariously in midair, Second Lieutenant Eisenhower vainly tried to persuade the irate colonel that he be allowed to climb the top of the cable and touch the flagpole before he came down. The colonel was adamant in his demand that Eisenhower get down immediately, whereupon he was dressed down as foolhardy, undignified, untrustworthy, undependable, and ignorant. The colonel had failed to appreciate the challenge to skill and endurance that had prompted Ike and his friends to bet $5 that he could climb one of those cables anchoring the 60-foot flagpole using hands only. Having delivered his reprimand, the colonel stalked off, leaving behind a very sheepish Ike, who was forced to call it a draw. Thus ended a day in the life of Second Lieutenant Eisenhower of the 19th Infantry, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. Ike's gambling luck was running pretty thin. Upon graduation from Westpoint, he and a couple of friends each bet $10 that he would be the last to marry. But Ike was the first to go, totally smitten by the pretty and vivacious Mamie Geneva Dowd of Denver and San Antonio.
One day I was sent on guard duty. You know, and the guard officer has to go out and inspect a whole row of sentinel posts. And I was just starting my out of my quarters to do this, with a belt on, you know, and my pistol and everything else. And across the street was a lady that I knew. She was one of the officers' wives. And she said, Ike, come over here. And I said, I'm sorry, Ms. Harris, I've got to go inspect the guard. She says, I just want you a minute. Come over. You don't have to stay the afternoon. I want you to meet some people. And I met this girl, and on the way over, according to what I was told later, she said, the woman hater of the post. Well, I was only a second lieutenant. I don't know how I got that name. I didn't know I did, because I assure you I didn't hate with it. But in any event, that must intrigue this girl. So when I said, well, I'm going to inspect the post now, and if you'd like to go along, I'd like to have you along. She just walked off, and we started.
Prior to meeting Mamie, Ike had applied for service in the aviation section of the Army. He was fascinated by the airplane, foreseeing its strategic and tactical value for the military, and excited by the dangerous new adventure of flying. About the same time that he and Mamie became engaged, Ike received his acceptance to the aviation section. But his prospective father-in-law didn't share his enthusiasm.
At that time, the Air Force was called the Aviation Division of the Signal Corps. And I applied for training and was accepted. And when I just become engaged, and my Ms. Ike's mother may not have been so adamant, but her dad hated the plane. Matter of fact, never in his whole life, and he lived till 80, never in his whole life did he go on an airplane. So this thing was so bitter with him. He just said that no girl of his could marry an aviator, and that was all because he looked on just as a suicide squad. Well, matter of fact, I was certainly far too deeply in love to let change in my career ruin my marriage, so I said, all right, I'll give it up. So I withdrew my applications, and so I never got in the Air Corps. But I did finally, maybe many years later, I did learn enough about flying that I soloed a while around the Philippines. It was very convenient over there.
Married life for the Eisenhowers was not made easy by the Army. Throughout Ike's military career, they led an almost nomadic existence, seemingly always on the move, sometimes forced to separate. Mamie would return to her family home either in Denver or San Antonio until Ike was stationed someplace where conditions permitted her to join him. Wherever they were able to make a home, however temporary, it became the gathering place for officers and wives of all ranks. They were a popular couple, remembered for their genial hospitality, graciousness, and friendship. The couple had 2 sons, of whom the first, little Icky, died of scarlet fever at the age of 3. For Ike, it was the greatest personal tragedy he ever suffered. The hand of fate would seem to have guided Ike in the long years following Westpoint and leading up to World War II. Preparation for his role in that war began with the training of men for service in the First World War. As a professional soldier, he'd felt duty-bound to be on the battlefield himself. Already some of his classmates had won distinction, a few had died. His attempts to go overseas were frustrated, though, by an endless series of assignments from one training camp to another. Every job he did with speed, efficiency, and hard work. And his military record began to accumulate the first of many superior ratings he would receive throughout his career. After the war, Ike worked closely with then-Colonel George S. Patton in developing a comprehensive tank doctrine. Instead of tanks being used as merely slow-moving, cumbersome adjuncts to the attacking infantry as they were in World War I, Eisenhower and Patton believed tanks should have an important role of their own, that they should have speed, reliability, and firepower, that they should be employed en masse, attacking the enemy by surprise and breaking through and enveloping his defensive positions. But Ike and Patton were widely criticized for impractical and dangerous ideas. The Army, solidly entrenched in traditions of warfare, lacked the foresight of these young, creative officers. If one person directly influenced Ike's attitude toward himself and his future in the Army, it was General Fox Connor. Ike was stationed in Panama as Connor's staff officer in the early 20s. Eisenhower historian Stephen Ambrose, author of The Supreme Commander, The War Years of General Dwight Eisenhower, speaks of Fox Connor.
One of those unfortunate individuals in military life, unfortunate in the sense that he was really too young to go to the very top in World War I. and he was too old by the time of World War II. Connor served as Pershing's G3 officer in charge of operations, his staff officer in charge of operations in France in World War I. And had there been another war in the next 10 or 15 years, Connor certainly would have been the head of the U.S. Army for it. His reputation throughout the Army was unexcelled. I think the thing that impressed me most was more than once in interviewing Eisenhower in the mid-60s, which is to say, interviewing a man who had been twice President of the United States, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, and in the process had gotten to know really all of the great men of the middle third of the century. Any of the great world leaders that one thinks of for the middle third of this century, Eisenhower knew. And yet in the mid-60s in interviews, he would say, Fox Connor was the ablest man I ever knew. He rated Connor ahead of all of them.
Connor acted as teacher, philosopher, and historian, and led Ike to an appreciation and understanding of the will and conduct of men. Stephen Ambrose.
What Connor did for him was to get him interested in his profession. In a way, for the first time in his life, he really got into what being a soldier was all about. Connor had him read a lot. Connor would give him... Connor, in effect, gave him a course in military history and military strategy. And he would read enormous amounts of material from Alexander the Great on through Napoleon and the American Civil War and into World War I. And then sit around and rap with Connor about it after dinner 4 or 5 nights a week. And Connor had a brilliant mind. The impression I have of Connor is that he would have been a really outstanding teacher. Connor used to tell him, if there's a next war, do everything, or in the next war, do everything you can to hitch up with George Marshall. Because Marshall is the guy that's going to be the head of the American Army the next time we fight. He emphasized very strongly that Eisenhower learned to think in global terms, because the next war would be a global war.
Fox Connor steadfastly believed, even as early as the 1920s, that the world would see another major war. He was convinced that Ike would play a major role in it, and urged him to be ready. Biographer Kenneth S. Davis.
I think that Connor did make him feel that there was going to be another war, and they were going to need generals, and that he was a guy who could very well be a great man. I think he did feel this, that there was this chance, and he wanted to be ready for it, take advantage of it if it came. Because he did after Connor, there's quite a if you think about Ike's career, there was a certain difference between him before Connor and after Connor. He was much more serious about his job after Connor than before.
Ike had kind of drifted along with life into his mid-30s, and suddenly with Connor he had to confront himself and decide whether he really wanted to be a soldier or not. And he decided he did.
Ike's military education came from several areas. He learned of strategy, tactics, and command at the Command and General Staff School. He placed first in his class. The textbooks were put to use in Louisiana, where he served as Chief of Staff to the Third Army in the largest field maneuvers in American history. Eisenhower's wartime aide, Harry Butcher.
General Ike attained a good deal of prestige out of those maneuvers because the referees found that he was able to move his men and his equipment and get over bridges and around across rivers, etc., more quickly than the others, and showed promise. It also happened that one of the observers was the Secretary of the General Staff, then Colonel, I believe, Beadle Smith, who later became General and who also later became Secretary of General Staff under General Ike's Allied commands. Beadle Smith reported back to Washington, to General Marshall, the good work of this upcoming Colonel Eisenhower, and also about the same time Pearson and Allen, who had the merry-go-round column, came out with a full column extolling the quality of leadership and accomplishment of this unknown colonel, which was I suppose you could call a fortunate circumstance for an unknown colonel.
In 1928, as author of the Guidebook to Battle Monuments of the First World War, Ike got a first-hand look at the people, politics, and terrain of Western Europe. He would remember them 16 years later as he prepared the invasion of France.
One of the best intellectual jobs he ever did in his life was that guidebook to the battlefields of Europe. I stress this in my book because I think it's true. It is a wonderful book. It really is. For considering I've done enough writing to know what a difficult job of organization that was, and it was a first-class job of intellectual operation. And he could do things like that. But you see, also, this is very revealing about Ike. He was one of the few guys in the Army, if not the only one, who realized that this was important, because Pershing was head of the Battlefield Monuments Commission.
From his service as assistant to General Douglas MacArthur, then military advisor to the Philippines preceding the war, Ike became personally acquainted with politics and diplomacy. His experience would later stand him in good stead during the North Africa campaign and preparations for the cross-channel invasion. But in the 26 years following Westpoint, there were many times when Ike felt he was going nowhere in the Army. Twice he considered quitting when he received offers of lucrative civilian jobs.
He once drew longhand a graph of his career in the Army. He was illustrating to me that he had been in grade as a major longer than most anybody. I think it was 13 years. In World War I, he had risen to the rank of colonel, and then when the war was over, he became a major, and as I say, 13 years. He had become over age in grade, which is a term that means that you're sort of a has-been, and when a war comes, you'll be passed over for younger men. So he didn't expect to have promotion. Was rather surprised when he got it.
The eventual choice of Eisenhower as supreme commander of the greatest Allied expeditionary force ever assembled was a natural one. He brought to that job a background richly diverse and knowledgeable in all areas of military experience. He carried with him the wisdom, advice, and solid learning of some of the greatest American military figures. And he offered an awareness of the history that had gone before that great event, and a premonition of what would follow should it not be resolved in the favor of democracy.
The Eisenhower Years, produced by Extension Radio Television at Kansas State University on a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. The producer-narrator is Ralph Titus. Westpoint and Beyond was researched and written by Anne Frank. Music for the Eisenhower Years was composed by Gail Kubik, performed by the Kansas State University Chamber Symphony, conducted by Luther Levengood. Our thanks to the following for materials used in this week's broadcast: National Educational Television, CBS News, WFLN Radio Philadelphia, and the Eisenhower Presidential Library. Next week, Torch to Overlord. This is Paul DeWeese.